Very good. So we are ready to start recording now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, very good. Ripudaman, please start recording and live streaming.
Recording has been started.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Strategically Speaking with Dr. Adityanjee, a feature of Council for Strategic Affairs. We have a distinguished guest today with whom I'll be carrying out a conversation. Ambassador Kanwal Sibal does not need any introduction. He was Foreign Secretary to the Government of India in 2001 to 2003. Since his retirement, he has been very active in Track 2 events. He's a prolific author. He's involved with several think tanks, including Vivekananda International Foundation. He has appeared on CSA platform before, and we are very happy to have a conversation with him on a very important topic, that is future of the BRICS. So welcome Ambassador Kanwal Sibal to Council for Strategic Affairs. For our viewers, today is Sunday, August 27th. It is 6 a.m. past in United States and around 11 a.m. in London, UK, where Ambassador Kanwal Sibal is there. So let's start with Ambassador. So we had the conclusion of the BRICS summit finish on Thursday. What is your overall take on BRICS expansion? Please.
Well, this expansion has been pushed by China and Russia. Both have today great interest in creating a group of countries which are willing to promote the concept of multipolarity, uh, which want to have greater say in global governance, which want a reform of the United Nations system, including its political and financial institutions, who want to hedge against the domination, uh, traditional domination of the West on the international system by having alternative platforms on which to express their views and gather support, and hope to be able to reduce pressures on them, which come in various ways from the West, because it's the West that actually traditionally decides on the global agendas. And then they push those agendas. Uh, Now, the point is whether this expansion should have been done as precipitately as has happened, or there should have been a staged process, as we have seen in other organizations, including the SCO, where India had to wait for several years before it became a full member. The same is the case with Iran. And of course, in the case of ASEAN, they have this process of uh, observers and dialogue partners before you become uh, members of their various institutions. It's the same thing in SCO. But in this case, they've gone ahead and decided within a few months of the idea being launched to expand BRICS. Having said that, I think in a sense it was inevitable. It was inevitable um, because the global South is becoming much more active. They are expressing their disagreements and even resentments uh, against the traditional domination of the West and the manner in which they are treated in various ways by the West that imposes its agenda uh, on them and then expects them to subscribe to that agenda. And if they don't, then there are always various forms of sanctions and punishments and penalties and this and that. Uh, they were not satisfied with the G20 because the G20 has the G7 plus EU in it already. There are other 12 members from the global South, but it is a more restricted organization. And some countries, group, and some countries were left out of this, as for example, Egypt, which always feels that it has a major role to play, especially in regional politics in the Middle East, so to say. And finally, I think what has precipitated this is the Ukraine conflict and the sharp deterioration of relations between the United States and China. Now, these countries may not approve of China's policies, I'm talking of the global south, and may not approve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but they do not agree with the manner in which the West is treating these issues, and they see double standards in them, especially in the case of Russia. They feel that they feel the pinch and the consequences of the sanctions because this has disrupted the supply of food grains and fertilizers and energy availability. The prices of these have risen. They are being pushed into subscribing to the sanctions against Russia. And in the case of China, they don't want to take sides. And especially the global south, as you know now, is very much connected with China's BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. And they have been able to obtain from China a lot of assistance by way of development of infrastructure and other forms of physical development. So they see in China a source of alternative funding for their development other than from the IMF and the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, where you know the assistance comes with a lot of uh, other conditionalities. Whereas in the case of the Chinese, they are pretty liberal in giving this. Liberal in the sense they don't bother about human rights. They don't want to. They don't interfere in their internal affairs. They're quite happy to deal with military regimes or with anti-democratic regimes. They don't give them any lectures of any kind. And of course, they corrupt the elites in these countries, which the IMF and the World Bank cannot do. So they corrupt the elites of these countries and are able to obtain projects for their companies. So for all these reasons, the BRICS expansion has taken place.
So, sir, coming back to very precipitate expansion, looking at intra-BRICS processes, there was reservation initially on part of both Brazil and India on BRICS expansion. And somehow their views were not taken into consideration. And the impression is gathered that China has used South Africa as quote unquote useful idiot. So have China, Russia, South Africa dictating the terms to Brazil and India in this process of precipitate expansion of BRICS. Any comments?
Well, in one sense, one can make the argument that China has been the driving force behind this expansion, and so has Russia in the new circumstances in which they find themselves. That is one. Number two, the biggest partner of China in Africa is South Africa. So they have invested a great deal of political and physical capital in that country, and they are in a position. They are in a position, therefore, to influence decision making in South Africa on this issue. On the other hand, and then of course, in terms of criteria, the criteria have not been made known as to what was the basis for expansion. Uh, Foreign Minister Lavrov, in his press conference in South Africa, gave an indication of what these criteria were, and in his view, it was countries which are important, which have international status, which represent the global South, which support multipolarity, and which want a greater say in international governance. And these were the broad criteria on which they assessed the eligibility for membership. Now, if you look at these broad criteria, many countries will fit into this. Many countries which have actually not been included. But then the question was that you have a list of 23 countries which have applied for membership. So how do you select a specific number of countries from these 23, which broadly would actually respond to the criteria that is laid down, broadly speaking? And that is where the bargaining comes in, that you choose countries on which there is consensus. Now, if you look at the countries that are chosen, I think it'll be very difficult to say that either Brazil or India would have any ground to object. And I'll tell you why. Because in the G20, Brazil is a member, but so is Argentina a member. So then, if it comes to BRICS, can Brazil say that, look, I don't want another Latin American country to join BRICS? I want to be the sole representative of Latin America in BRICS. Very difficult argument to make. In our case, we have very good ties with Saudi Arabia, excellent ties with UAE, very good ties with Egypt. We have very good ties with Argentina. And we have very good ties with Ethiopia, long traditional ties with Ethiopia. And of course, very good ties of a very strategic nature with Iran. So how do we then say no to these countries? Remember, we have strategic partnership with 5 of the 6 new members of BRICS, one. Number 2, 4 of the new 6 members, their presidents have been chief guests at our Republic Day ceremonies. So it was very difficult, therefore, for India to say no, even if the push came from China, and even if they were using South Africa as their useful idiot, as you said, because you have to have credibility in your positions. So I think India went along because they were comfortable that with these countries, we already have very good relations, and if they are there as members of the BRICS platform, it doesn't harm our interests. And in fact, we'll be able to counter the influence of China within the expanded BRICS because of our very good relations with these countries. Now, there are some very important omissions which I must mention. They have 4 additional members from one broad region: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran. So it is lopsided. They have got 1 from Latin America and 1 from Africa. Now, Ethiopia, even if you have excellent relations with them, actually doesn't qualify at all.
Yeah.
It is in the midst of a very serious civil war. It is facing prolonged drought. Its economy is in a mess. But other than South Africa, Ethiopia is a hub for Chinese influence in that very sensitive region of Africa. Asia is absent. There's no representation from Asia. Now, Indonesia's president was present there, and now they've let it be known that at the last minute they withdrew their candidature because they wanted to reflect more on the pros and cons of becoming members. But Asia is absent. Nigeria is absent because Nigeria is far more eligible candidate than Ethiopia if you have to have an African member. But Nigeria also said they did not apply for membership. Now, it's not ending here. It's not ending here because this summit has decided a BRICS Plus partnership. And the foreign ministers of the BRICS countries have been asked to work out the details of the criteria on which these partnerships would be established. And they have in mind about 60 countries as a pool with which they are willing to develop these partnerships. And a decision will be taken on this at the Kazan summit next year in Russia. So this is not the end of BRICS expansion.
So apparently China was pushing for Turkey's inclusion, Nigeria, Mexico, and Indonesia. But Turkey was not considered in this round of expansion. Perhaps in the Kazan summit, Turkey may be admitted, and once Turkey gets in, will China try to get Pakistan also into BRICS Plus?
Well, Turkey can't get in if India objects, and India has problems with Turkey. You see, India has no problem with any of these six states, as I mentioned, and I listed why. So therefore, we could easily be part of consensus. But how can they force Turkey's membership on us? And of course, Pakistan is not in the reckoning for the time being. With regard to Indonesia uh, and Nigeria, one can either take at face value what their leadership is saying, that they, in the case of Nigeria, that they didn't apply, and in the case of Indonesia, they withdrew their request at the last minute. You can either take it at its face value, uh, in other words, it's face saving because they could not enter, and therefore they say we were not interested in entering, Mhm. or or it could be that there was no consensus that could be built. Now, why would any country, including India, because in the whole game of the Indo-Pacific, we are trying to bring Indonesia in, and Indonesia is being responsive, and we have very good relations with Indonesia. We will not object. Uh, Russia, I don't think would object. China, China, I'm not very sure where China would have wanted Indonesia, Indonesia in. It is possible that Indonesia was put under pressure by some ASEAN members and by the United States because Indonesia is a key to is a key element in the whole strategy of the Indo-Pacific. Um, and uh, and of course, when it comes to the Quad, there again there is an attempt to see if we can find some modus vivendi between the Quad and Indonesia, because it is sitting on very vital sea lanes of communication. So it's possible that at the last minute they were put under pressure and they decided to withdraw their candidature. And in the case of Nigeria, it's speculation. I can't say that, but if they actually didn't apply, it's another matter. But if they applied, then who would object? South Africa may feel more comfortable with a relative non-entity as Ethiopia as a member, rather than a competing power like Nigeria. But I can't say, this is speculative.
So if we look at the history of BRICS, in 2011, China again in a very precipitate manner forced South Africa's entry into BRICS. Although South Africa did not qualify, BRICS started as actually as an economic, as a geo-economic entity, and South Africa had no place, but China brought in South Africa to balance India and Brazil in the BRIC grouping. And what it led to was killing of IPSA, because after 2011, there have not been any meetings of IPSA. So China achieved its strategic goals by bringing South Africa into the BRICS processes and killing the trilateral India had formed in the form of IPSA. Any comments on that?
Well, I was involved in the creation of IPSA, and it is the fact that China wanted to enter IPSA because the South-South cooperation with India, Brazil, and South Africa coming together and forming a group of their own, and China sensing that this gave India a leadership position in the entire South-South concept, wanted to have an opportunity to see if they could either join or kill the concept, which indirectly they did by strongly recommending the inclusion of South Africa in BRICS. On the other hand, India was put in a difficult position. India was not happy with this, but India had given its, again, very long standing relations with South Africa, our large Indian community there. and emotional, sentimental attachment because of Gandhiji and everything else, uh, could not say no. Uh, that is one. The other is that um, the the South Africa uh, inclusion of South Africa, in a sense, uh, gave a broader continental uh, dimension to BRICS. Earlier, it was, if you count Russia as a Eurasian country now, not as a European, but assuming that it's a European country, so you had Europe and Asia and Latin America represented in BRICS. And now you had Africa. So in that sense, uh, it got a wider geopolitical spread. Now, with regard to what you said earlier, and again, since I was associated with the formation of the Russia, India, China dialogue and BRIC, not BRICS, for the Russians, it was actually never really an economic grouping. It was a political grouping. It was a geopolitical grouping. And when the first meeting of the foreign ministers of BRIC countries took place, the Russians insisted that foreign ministers should represent, not the economic ministers. I was then in favor that we should send the economic ministers. But government sent a foreign minister because the Russians were demanding that. So for them, they have always looked upon the BRICS as a counterweight to the West, as a seeding ground for building multipolarity, of sending the message that there are countries from various continents, major countries, which do not accept the kind of West-dominated world and international order that exists, and wants to have other options, and wants to have another streams of thought and recommendations and about international governance, and not give a free run to the West in everything they want to do.
Incidentally, about killing of IBSA, in 2013 in a paper, I had made a proposal, and the title of the paper was Invigorating IBSA. And I had actually submitted the proposal stating that IBSA from trilateral become a pentalateral involving Indonesia and Argentina. So IBSA still remains IBSA, but it becomes IIBSA. So involve Argentina and Indonesia into this trilateral. The defining criteria would be that these countries are democracies and they represent large continents, so there would be a kind of better representation. And I had some difficulty with IDSA getting that paper published. And after 3 months, they rejected the paper. So I had to publish it elsewhere. Any comments? As if kind of, a lot of water has flown. That was 2013. Shouldn't India have taken a proposal on itself, the leadership to involve these countries earlier?
Well, there are sort of, you're right. It is a very attractive idea. It was a very attractive idea, but there are some nuances I would like to introduce here. One is that while India became a votary of South-South cooperation, as you know, there was a South Commission, and Manmohan Singh was the Secretary General of the South Commission, and this and that. Uh, and Lula in Brazil, again, is a votary of South-South cooperation. And then when we saw, actually, I remember when we saw the map of the world, there was no direct connection between India, South Africa, and Brazil. I mean, if you wanted to go to Brazil, you had to go via Europe. If you wanted to go to South Africa, there were no direct connections. And then there were a lot of ideas on the table about the issues on areas in which uh, we could collaborate and all that. The point is, at that time, India did not really have the capacities to take the leadership of the global South as we are doing today. India has the capacities today, which is why when we talk about the global South and we want to take the leadership, when we invite 125 countries, just before the BRICS G20 foreign ministers meeting to garnish all the ideas that the global South has about what should be on the G20 agenda, etc., etc. Uh, we have credibility in doing this. At that time, it was more sentimental. Neither of the three countries really had those kind of capacities to establish direct links. All that because all that depends also the amount of economic linkages you have. There was some idea of defense cooperation because South Africa has a pretty solid defense industry. So does Brazil and India. well, had also in its own way a defense industry of note. Those they didn't reach anywhere. Now Indonesia, coming to your, Indonesia is a very hesitant country, very cautious country. It doesn't want to take sides. It keeps a low profile. Even now, it finds it very difficult to raise its profile, to take leadership. It's very conscious of the fact that it's the biggest country in ASEAN, and if it takes a leadership role, it might meet resistance within the group, etc., etc. It's only 2-3 years ago, I remember, the Indonesian defense minister came to the Raisina dialogue, and it was considered a big step by Indonesia to have actually taken the courage to send their defense minister to India. So while that idea of yours had its merit, but I'm not too sure that the time was ripe at that time to actually develop this project
So
into something real.
coming back to BRICS achievements, one of the notable achievements is the NDB or BRICS Bank. If one goes deeper into that, that was an idea floated by Dr. Manmohan Singh.
Yes.
What led to its incorporation of the headquarters in Shanghai and not in Mumbai or New Delhi?
Well, one can only say that within BRICS, and even more so now, China has the biggest economic weight. And when you set up the new development bank, if you look at the shares that were given to various countries, China is 55%. So as being the biggest shareholder, I suppose they wanted to claim the right to have the headquarters in Shanghai. India could have resisted, but I think it would have been a relatively less important strategic battle, to fight. And so I suppose that is the rationale for that. And the New Development Bank has done well. That contingency reserve fund has done well. And now few countries have actually become members of the New Development Bank, including Bangladesh. And for all I know, actually, it is running along good, solid lines, and not political lines. It is, in fact, Russia is unhappy that because of sanctions, the previous director of the New Development Bank refused to further finance BRICS projects in Russia. And now, of course, with Dilma Rousseff becoming the new chairman or president of the bank, I think the things will change. Yes, it could have been in India, but I won't worry too much about it.
Okay. There was a lot of talk about floating a BRICS currency prior to this summit. Where is the idea? Does it have legs?
No, there is a walking back from it. If you look at the press conference of Lavrov in South Africa, where he was asked this question, he said, "Well, what we are discussing for the moment is not that, but we want to increase trade and other areas of cooperation between the BRIC countries. And we have charged the finance ministers and the central banks of the BRICS countries to see how this trade can be done in their national currencies. So for the time being, the focus is on using national currencies in trade between amongst the BRIC countries, and not a BRIC currency or a BRIC reserve currency, because that can remain a project behind the scenes, a kind of an aspiration to which you you might we want to realize, but in practical terms, frankly, it's a bit of a non-starter. It's a bit of a non-starter. One. Number two, no country would want to give up the control of its own currency. Number three, you see where the euro is, despite the fact that the problems within the euro zone, despite the fact that all members of the same alliance, same economic union, and this and that, and yet they have huge problems managing that. And here, countries are disparate with different geopolitical interests, with serious tensions amongst them. Can you imagine China and India agreeing on this, or Saudi Arabia now with the expanded membership, Saudi Arabia and Iran agreeing on this, or things like that? So I think for the time being, Russia itself, as I said, has tried to downplay this issue. However, moment you start using your national currencies in trade, you're already taking a step not towards the BRICS currency, but the de-dollarization of the global economy. And that is where the West is expressing a great deal of concern as to what this might mean. And with the membership of Saudi Arabia and UAE and this and that, and Iran into the new expanded BRICS, there's greater worry that some of the biggest oil producers, some of the biggest oil consumers are now part of the BRICS, and what this might mean in terms of petrodollars. Already, Saudi Arabia and China are using their national currencies for oil trade, and India has just bought 1 million tons of 1 million barrels of oil from UAE against rupee payment. So I think the direction of what might happen in the course of time is clear, but I don't think there is any scope as yet of thinking seriously about a BRICS currency.
Well, use of local currencies is fine. India has tried to do that and gradually has been able to, have that mechanism in place. Previously, there was with Russia or erstwhile Soviet Union, rupee ruble barter trade. That was a kind of variant of the same process. De-dollarization is inevitable, but one needs to keep in consideration de-dollarization should not be replaced by yuanization.
Right, you're right.
That is where India needs to keep its fingers on the button, that just like inadvertently you float the idea of new development bank and China hijacks it in the BRICS. Similarly, use of local currency supplementing de-dollarization should not lead to yuanization of BRICS or BRICS Plus or BRICS Global South, family.
You see, if you really look at India, uh, our biggest trade partner in trade and services, in goods and services, is the United States. 100 and God knows, almost going to $200 billion shortly. There's no question of any payments between India and United States being in any other currency except dollars. Similarly, with Europe, as an entity, it's our biggest trade partner. So, so there's no question of India supporting de-dollarization. It doesn't suit our strategic interests. What we really want is to use the rupee more and more in our international transactions, beginning with our neighbors, and then in a larger neighborhood, and then through these unified payment systems, this and that, make the rupee more international, as we've done with Singapore and with UAE, and in a very, very, very small way, tentative way with France. So that is what our goal is. However, if you really look at what is happening, uh, I think US has made a very serious mistake in weaponizing the dollar, as they have done in the case of the Ukraine conflict, confiscating the foreign exchange reserves of countries, the gold reserves of countries, sanctioning the property of individuals, threatening countries with secondary sanctions if they did not uh, abide by the sanctions imposed by United States because of the power of the dollar and status as the international reserve currency. So they have sent all the wrong signals and and made the countries very cautious about the future. Even if they're not anti-West, even if they want to increase their dealing with United States, come closer to the United States, strategic sense and larger national interest would demand that you look at what is happening and have concern about the future. So, in that sense, I think the use of national currencies in trade as much as possible is a good option because it protects you against sanctions. And insofar as yuan is concerned, to my mind, China is not very anxious either to make yuan an international currency in the same sense, because that would mean end of all capital controls, which would mean a huge outflow of capital from China, as it is. Those guys are already um, taking out capital from China, and China currently is in pretty serious trouble. Then the entire management of the currency in China would have to become very transparent. And given the Chinese system today, can you expect that kind of transparency from them? And therefore, can they actually win the confidence of other countries that the management of their currency would be such that they can rely on it fully? So I don't think at the moment or in the short or medium term there is any chance of the yuan becoming some sort of a international currency. At the moment, maybe you know the statistics better. My impression is that only 2% of the international transactions are being done in yuan. But yes, between Russia and China, 80% of their trade is now in national currencies. So uh, I think you can have these pockets, geopolitical pockets, where national currencies operate, but we are far from a situation where either yuan becomes the national currency or the global economy becomes de-dollarized.
There was a new proposal floated by India about BRICS space collaboration. What are your thoughts on this proposal?
I think I think Prime Minister Modi, very very plugged in politician that he is, on the back of our huge success in landing the moon rover, our moon rover on the south pole of the moon. Just a couple of days after Russia, which is a great space power, failed, and before that Japan and Israel failed, was the moment for him, with a lot of credibility, to take leadership in this area and talk about space cooperation, which can be in many areas, in peaceful areas, and this and that and that. After all, we now have we want to launch satellites of other countries. We have shown the capacity to do so. Uh, at the moment, Russia and China in BRICS are the major space powers, but we have raised our flag and we want to take the leadership. I think it is pretty astute on Prime Minister to have launched this idea.
There's already this International Lunar Research Association that is heavily by China and Russia. Would they give up that and focus more on BRICS space collaboration proposal?
No,
Or maybe
actually,
some intersectionality of both the programs?
well, a few things. One, of course, is that India and Russia have had years of space cooperation. That everybody knows, your listeners know. So therefore, if we are achieving successes in space, Russia will be a credible partner and willing to cooperate with us. Uh, Number one. Number two, Russia and China have been cooperating a lot. In fact, if you look at many of the things that the Chinese have done in terms of their space capsules and everything else, I mean, even to a layman, it appears that it is a copycat uh, of the Russian technology. So there has been a lot of outflow of Russian technology to China, but now China has built up its independent capacities. They are building their own space platform and this and that. India also has this on the agenda. So India and Russia can cooperate, but I don't foresee India and China cooperating in this area because this area also has very strong strategic and military dimensions.
It's a dual use or dual application subject, and there is increasingly militarization and weaponization of space. And that is where China is definitely an adversary. So one has to be a little bit cautious. Also, in the International Lunar Research Station, Pakistan is a member. So just like, China took the initiative of NDB from India and headquartered it in Shanghai because of the cloud. Again, India may have floated the proposal when two much more advanced space powers are there in BRICS. What would be India's locust and eye, or what would be India's cloud, if this space proposal is actually implemented? I think one needs to look cautiously.
I think, Dr. Adityanjee, this is more directed at the expanded BRICS. This proposal is not directed at Russia or China. With Russia, space cooperation will continue. With China, there will be no space cooperation. But this is directed at the other countries, which want to launch satellites, which want to have space program their own. The UAE has that program of its own. They want to launch Mars missions and stuff like that. I think it is that part of BRICS that India is targeting, in a sense, taking the leadership of the global South and not leaving it to China. And I think to that extent, it's a very wise move.
As long as we, focus on commercial applications, because again, space technology is dual use, and with creeping militarization, weaponization, since the BRICS process is going to expand, you don't want like countries like Turkey and Pakistan to use the BRICS umbrage to try to gain advantage vis-a-vis India's strategic interests. So one will have to be very cautious.
You're right there, but we have a very, as you know, when our Prime Minister went to the United States, there is a big chapter on space cooperation with the United States. So, so it's not as if India is putting its eggs in the BRICS basket, not at all. So, India is rising as a space power on its own, and it has now, with the lunar mission, success of the lunar mission, obtained a great deal of credibility. So we are on a good wicket, and this will open doors to us, both in United States and in Europe to some extent, and in the developing countries, because of the fact that our services will be cheaper. We have excellent space cooperation with France, for instance, where again, if you look at in Prime Minister's visit to France and the joint statement, there is a big chapter on space cooperation, and I have some personal knowledge about the content of this, which is more than commercial. So I don't think we need to be worried about this lunar whatever the Chinese are up to. It's all right. It looks good on paper, but I don't know
Well,
how seriously it will compromise our strategic interests.
when NATO was launched, Lord Ishmael had said that the purpose of NATO is to keep America in, Soviets out, and Germany down. Now, in that sense, China's strategy has been to keep India out of any international platform and bring Pakistan in. If you look at every stage, whether it was NSG, China brought Pakistan, whether it was SCO expansion, China brought Pakistan. Uh, China was one of the major hurdles in India's possible entry into APEC. China is the only country that is blocking United Nations Security Council P5 expansion. So you have to see what is the trend, how China is using Pakistan to balance India into international platforms, and one needs to be cautious.
But let me be a little non-serious. What has it all led to? The collapse of Pakistan. Pakistan is finding it very difficult to survive. Pakistan has lost credibility, and China's support for Pakistan it has become a form of embarrassment. So they can't keep propping up Pakistan, which is collapsing from within. So, yes, you are right that they have used Pakistan even much more seriously to counter India strategically by sharing with them nuclear and missile technologies. And of course, through this um, China Pakistan economic corridor, slighting our sovereignty concerns. With this regard, especially as they themselves have recognized in the 1964 agreement with Pakistan that this territory doesn't belong to Pakistan. So China is mischievous. There is no doubt. But China's support from Pakistan in the international arena uh, is actually, to my mind, a form of becoming a form of embarrassment to China. Although the way they are, the sense of confidence and this whole notion of being the center of the universe and everything else, that sort of mentality is still there. So they may not bother. But the fact is that despite all playing the Pakistan card against us, look at where India is today and where India is heading. Fifth largest economy, third largest by 2027. China's economy slowing down, India's economy continuing to rise, gap closing progressively. In PPP terms, the gap between India and China is much smaller than in nominal terms, dollar terms. So I think let's look at the facts on the ground. Now, insofar as the UNSC expansion is concerned, Lavrov made it clear, which one knew already, made it clear publicly this time in South Africa that while India and Brazil are legitimate candidates for membership of the Security Council, no question of Germany or Japan. So it's not only China that is obstructing or will obstruct the expansion of the Security Council based on the candidature of these four countries, but Russia also is not in favor.
Well, we are straying away from BRICS, so let's come back to BRICS. With the future expansion, will BRICS become a copy of G77 or the NAM?
Well, that'll finish it. That'll finish it. You know, the interesting thing is that you have G7, which was created by the Western powers. And you have the G20, which again resulted from the initiative of the West because they couldn't cope on their own. The G7 couldn't cope on their own with the 2008 financial crisis and wanted the big economies of the global south to come in and help uh, control the financial situation and avoid recession and everything else. But both of these were Western led initiatives. And now you have a G11, which is a non Western group where the initiative has come from the non Western countries. And now you have three players on the ground where the G20 is sort of a kind of a bridge between the G7 and the G11 because there's some common membership of the G20 and the G11. So it's an interesting international grouping system that is developing, which will have a lot of importance in terms of what you call loosely building a multipolar world and countering the traditional hegemony of the West. But if, as you say, and if G11 then starts expanding itself because it develops a momentum of its own, where both China and Russia feel that this is the best message to send to the West, that your days of hegemony are over, the global South is behind us, they are resisting you, they do not want the isolation of Russia, and they don't want a confrontation between China and the United States, that this plays uh, into their larger strategic goals internationally. But then, uh, then to achieve, even now within G11, to achieve a consensus on issues will become even more difficult. Now you have rivalries. Earlier on within BRICS, there was very serious rivalry between India and China. And now you have a rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between UAE and Saudi Arabia, between Egypt and Iran, between Egypt and Ethiopia. So how are you going to get an agreement on many vital issues, except in very general terms, so sort of lowest common denominator? So to that extent, one has to see what what would be the end result of the G11 in terms of a sharp focus on the interests of the global South and not necessarily the interests of China or Russia in terms of countering the West, because all the new entrants have very close ties with the West, including India. So they don't want this new grouping to become an anti-Western platform. But when you bring Iran in, what do you expect Iran to do or say? Uh, so, let's see what happens as we go along.
Well, one should not be a naysayer, but mindless expansion of BRICS will lead it to the fate of G77. It will become somewhat meaningless entity if you bring too many people in. But that brings me to my next question. There's a lot of chatter about, BRICS now, BRICS extended, BRICS plus, controlling the energy resources. So you have Russia, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Iran, you have UAE. So, there's a sort of sense that, a large percentage of energy producing nations are in BRICS. Will it supplement or supplant the OPEC plus one cartel, or there is likelihood of BRICS becoming a cartel of energy rich countries?
No, as I said, I don't know if I said that, but Lavrov again has thrown some kind of cold water on this. He was asked specifically this question about BRICS Energy Alliance and this and that. And he said, "Oh, look, BRICS already has its own energy cooperation. If the new countries have some proposals with regard to how they can cooperate with the existing structures BRICS has set up, we will look at them and implement them." In other words, very tentative. That is one. The other is that OPEC had a very large membership. So it's not as if Saudi Arabia or Russia or Russia is plus one, Saudi Arabia or Iran or UAE for that matter can take all the decisions with regard to OPEC production, OPEC pricing, and everything else simply within BRICS. It's not possible. Though, mind you, what can happen is that the BRICS can provide a platform, an additional platform, or rather, I don't know if it's an additional multilateral platform for the consuming countries, which are always very concerned about the rise in oil prices and stability of oil supplies, especially India and also China, to be able to discuss these issues with the major oil producers and gas producers. To that extent, yes, it can be a useful platform. But To imagine that they can supplant OPEC and all, no, I don't think it's realistic.
It has been a pleasure talking to you, Ambassador Sibal, on the future of BRICS. And we had a very interesting conversation. We hope our viewers would continue to like you to come to our platform on various issues related to international relations and geopolitics. Thanks a lot for your kind gesture of coming on our platform. Thank
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you very much. All the best.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.